In this video, we're going to look at the criticisms of multiculturalism. There are four aspects to this. There are the conservative criticisms, the liberal criticisms, the feminist criticisms, and the social reformist or broadly left-wing criticisms or critiques of multiculturalism. The strongest critique or criticism of multiculturalism comes from conservatives. Conservatives who argue that shared values and traditions and a common culture are a necessary precondition for a stable and successful society. And this is based on the conservative idea of human nature that we covered in Unit 3, and particularly the idea that humans are psychologically flawed and we are drawn to others who are similar to ourselves, and we have a fear and distrust of strangers, and therefore a fear and distrust of foreigners and foreign cultures are inevitable and natural. Conservatives also argue that multiculturalism also perpetrates a new reverse set of injustices on the host population, guilt-tripping them, associating them with colonialism and racialism, while favouring minority groups through minority rights such as positive discrimination and allocating special rights to certain groups. From conservative perspective, and this idea of diversity within unity is merely a sham, and multicultural societies are inherently flawed, fractured and conflict-ridden societies. Conservative responses to multiculturalism would be integration, as we mentioned in the previous video, to assimilation, controlled immigration, or indeed on the far right would be forced repatriation. Second set of criticisms are the liberal criticisms or the liberal critique of multiculturalism. And for liberals, the key threat posed by multiculturalism would be to individual liberty. Like nationalism, multiculturalism, with its emphasis on communitarianism, is simply a form of collectivism in which the rights of the individual are subordinated to the rights of the group. Sen argued that this can lead to the miniaturization of society, which can make violence more likely as people identify only with their own culture and fail to recognize the rights and integrity of other cultural groups. Multiculturalism thus leads to the ghettoization of society, a lack of tolerance and a lack of understanding of other cultures. Even when liberals are sympathetic to multiculturalism, they condemn the pluralist and especially particularist forms, largely for its cultural separateness, but also these forms of multiculturalism can be used to legitimize anti-democratic and anti-liberal or illiberal theories and systems and practices. And finally, this concept of offense or giving offense to minority cultures clearly contradicts the traditional liberal notion of freedom of speech. Again, as we saw in a previous video, liberalism is only compatible with multiculturalism to a certain extent. It's multiculturalism, but within this liberal framework, it absolutizes liberal values. A fourth critique is that of feminist critique, and many feminists have criticized multiculturalism, especially when aspects of minority rights and cultural practices such as dress codes, family structures, and access to elite positions. For feminists, these merely serve to preserve and legitimize patriarchal and traditionalist beliefs that systematically disadvantage women. And as such, feminists would argue that multiculturalism is simply used to maintain male power structure and female subordination. The final critique is that social reformist or broadly left-wing criticism. And from the social reformist critique, they would argue that multiculturalism fails to adequately address the real issue which causes the disadvantage of minority groups. And it's not the lack of cultural recognition, but it's a lack of economic power. Multiculturalists social reformers would argue, focus on advancing or addressing disadvantage through cultural and ethnic assertiveness, whereas social reformers such as Barry would argue that it's the lack of economic power which disadvantages these communities. And Barry argues that the emphasis on cultural distinctiveness merely seeks to divide those people who should have a common economic interest while narrowing their sense of social responsibility. And essentially, it's a divide and rule argument. By focusing on your particular culture or your particular cultural group, it puts you in competition with other cultural groups for resources and prevents you from recognizing the interest that you have as a common humanity or across your class interests. And multiculturalism, in a way, like nations and nationalism, only tends to divide people, whereas really it prevents them from recognizing where the true interests lie. So they are the four main critiques or criticisms of multiculturalism: conservative, liberal, feminist, and social reformist.